energy, reflects the spiritual energy of that week. You could say it's kind of like the source of the, or the conduits, kind of both, of the spiritual energy of the week. And I mean, this is really amazing because that means it's a week of redemption. Last week was also a week of redemption, but really last week and this week, they're weeks of what? Plagues against the Egyptians. So that's kind of like, you know, beating down impurity, beating down, you know, negative forces, put it that way. Evil forces, if you will. Forces that are oppose God. You know, that's what it spiritually represents. I mean, that's what Pharaoh represented. And obviously his culture, which was fully idolatrous, was a culture that did not recognize God. As Pharaoh himself said, who is God that I should listen to him? And since then, God has kind of been showing Pharaoh and his people, you know, who he is in more ways than one, time after time. You know, he's getting hit. And part of the question is, you know, are the plagues, what is the purpose of the plagues? You know, that's a question the commentaries discuss. And it can be approached in multiple ways. Obviously, the point of the plagues was to convince Pharaoh to let the children of Israel leave and serve God, and they should continue towards the land of Canaan. But it also had other reasons, which actually the Torah itself says, right? One objective is that they should know that I am God, and all of the earth should know, all of the people should know that I am God. So that the plagues acted as a means of godly revelation to the world. Another aspect is the plagues reflected not only God's attribute of justice, but also God's attribute of compassion, because God would bring a plague and then Pharaoh would ask, please stop it, and it would stop. So in fact, the Rebbe points out that the magicians were able to bring a plague, but they were not able to stop a plague. So Moses' ability to convey to God Pharaoh's wish or request that the plague stop, and they did stop, reflected God's attribute of mercy. And that's, you know, it's really important for people to understand that God is not just a source of justice or, you know, I guess troubles, but a source of compassion. You know, and there's also the aspect of that the plagues show that God controls all aspects of the natural world. Each plague, I mean, we start, interestingly enough, I think really at the heart of Egypt. We start in the Nile, which represented to Egypt the source of its life, the source of you know, its ecosystem. All creatures, you know, got their nourishment. The vegetation came from the Nile, and also the animals drank from the Nile. And so everything came from that water source. And the first thing that happens is this water source is attacked, right? It's turned to blood and no one can drink it. All the fish die. So really, I mean, Pharaoh is hit very hard in terms of his belief system immediately. And it's interesting that this is very strong language that Pharaoh turned away and he didn't pay attention to this at all. Even this, it says, also this he didn't pay attention to. In other words, the signs that Moses brought, he didn't pay attention to. And then the plague of the blood, he didn't pay attention to. So, I mean, the plague of blood is very interesting because it's so, you can see from this plague the different aspects of the objectives of the plagues. Because on the one hand, it shows this lesson about who God is, that God controls the life source of Egypt. It also represented a kind of a form of warning or punishment because, I mean, to me, there's a great symbolism in the blood in the Nile, because what did Pharaoh do? He ordered all of the firstborn Jewish males to be thrown into the Nile. So the fact that the Nile now is full of blood is kind of really a revelation of a reality, if you think about it. It's a revelation of what Pharaoh had done to his own water source. In other words, he filled his water source full of blood, right? Just like it says about that God said to Cain, that your brother's blood is calling out from you from the ground. So too, this is kind of was like a revelation of the great guilt that Egypt had. I mean, that's I think to me, that's the symbolism that really rings poetically from this plague. I'd say in a certain sense more than others. You know, immediately there's a symbolism that I think Pharaoh should have picked up on, that this is a form of justice, and that God knows what you did, right? You know, our sages also say that Pharaoh bathed in the blood of Israelite children to try to cure his leprosy. So again, we have this element of guilt through blood. You know, so we have the first two plagues are related to the Nile, because the frogs, it's a form of an animal and it's coming from the Nile also, right? But I was wondering if there's also an element of not only this showing a Pharaoh that God controls the water source and the animals that live within the water source, right? But there's also another element of justice here, in that these frogs drove the Egyptians crazy. They were making noise everywhere. They wouldn't leave them alone, and they went into their, we say in Jewish, they went into their kishkes, which means their intestines. But the point is, they went inside their innards, right? That's what our sages say, that they went literally everywhere. And to me, I see there's a great justice in that. There's a great measure for measure also, because I can imagine that the Egyptians, when they enslaved the Israelites, they just wouldn't, there was a form of it, they wouldn't leave them alone. It says that the taskmasters came early in the morning to get them out of bed, that they wouldn't give them any rest. So this is kind of a plague that gave the Egyptians no rest. They were continuously disturbed. You know, they had no peace. So, and then they had they couldn't relax. So I don't know if I have the exact, answer for every single plague, but so many of them, you see this aspect. The same thing with the lice. It's a terrible disturbance, bodily disturbance, and it could reflect, again, the fact that the Egyptians, physically harmed them, or maybe didn't, have worked them so hard that they were left without the ability to clean themselves, and they got lice. But I think all these things are related. It's a discomfort. It's a terrible discomfort, and we're getting greater severities of discomfort. So that the pain and discomfort and humiliation that they caused the children of Israel came back on them. I think that that's clear. That there was a measure for measure here against them. They caused pain and disturbance and suffering emotionally, physically, and that came back on their heads. I think the animals also, it's very interesting that the plague of the animals was a multitude, a mixed multitude of wild animals. And it doesn't say in the verses that any Egyptians were killed by these animals. Rashi brings that they bit, I think he does mention that they killed them, but the verse doesn't say anything about killing them. I definitely think that the animals represented the physical punishment and torture that the Egyptians meted out to Israelite slaves and Israelite people. And that was a direct, they whipped them, the animals bit them and scratched them and tore them up just in the same way that they did to the Israelites. So I think there's a measure for measure. But actually, the Rebbe, in one of his talks, disagrees, or at least emphasizes a different point, and says that all the plagues, except for the last one, were for the purpose of showing the Egyptians God's, revealing God's power, God's nature, and that his dominion over all things and different types of things. But the last one was a punishment. And the truth is that we start from the beginning with this proclamation that Moses tells Pharaoh. What does he tell him? He says, that Israel is my firstborn son. Let them go, or I'm going to kill your firstborn son. And that's what it is, what eventually happens. But the Rebbe says that the last one was an actual punishment. The killing of the firstborn, it was a punishment. I think he says it's a punishment for idolatry. So, the truth is, this explains something that is difficult, and that is, why is it that by all the first 9 plagues, the children of Israel didn't have to do any type of mitzvah? They had no command that they had to do to gain protection, to gain some merit in order not to be punished, not to also be inflicted by the plague. And yet here suddenly on this plague, in this punishment, or I should say, yeah, in this plague and in this phenomenon, suddenly they have to take some action. They have to do a good deed. Why is that? So that's what the Rabbi answers, is that because this one was actually a punishment. This was actually a judgment. And the problem is that the Jewish people, or the children of Israel at that time, were idol worshippers as well. And therefore, at least some of them were. And therefore, they could get caught up in this punishment as well, unless they did something which gained them the sufficient merit. And he explains that the merit here was that they were risking their lives to obey sent. They were doing something that could put them at great risk, because they were sacrificing and insulting one of the main gods of Egypt, which was, I guess, a lamb god. I assume it's one of their animal-headed gods, is like a lamb, I guess. I don't know. But this is what our sages say. Well, the verses themselves say that Moses said, "This is your God, and we can't slaughter them here because this is your deity," right? I mean, Moses in the scripture says it, so clearly this was the case. So because of that, it really took a lot for them to do it. They really were putting themselves at risk of possibly literally physical harm or death, and at the very least ridicule and a lot of discomfort, but more likely maybe even a more severe punishment. So he argues that when a person exercises self-sacrifice in the service of God, that wipes the slate clean. And because it's a nullification of self. And so you begin a new slate after that. It's a new slate. So that's why they had to do something that involves self-sacrifice in order to cleanse themselves of this sin. That's very interesting. So, so just to get back to my first point for a moment, is that this is a time that we could take advantage to know and to gain a certain amount of, inspiration, that this is a time where we can succeed in overcoming, bad habits, evil inclinations, which are represented by Egypt, which are lack of God consciousness, right? Rebellion against God in different ways. And it can be even, in very nuanced ways, in very subtle ways. Those can be some forms of Egypt. Again, in Hasidic thinking, the Egypt in Hebrew, Mitzrayim, means also boundaries. It means restriction. So the idea of Egypt is being restricted, obstructed, unable to, have a close relationship with God. Person's unable to have proper, expression of their good side of themselves. Their holy soul is trapped in a certain way. Is limited. Is repressed. These are the ideas that symbolically, allegorically, Egypt represents. I think it's a wonderful way to look at it, because, in other words, there's 2 ways for us to look at evil. We can look at evil as something that can harm ourselves, that could cause us real destruction. And I'm not saying that that's incorrect. However, that could cause fear of evil, or fear of impurity, and we can't be afraid. We have to be able to fight. We have to be able to contend and challenge it and try to overcome it. So we don't really want to do that. So what's so beautiful about this approach is that it's basically saying that it's a restriction, meaning to say we have it in us to want to have a relationship with God. We just got to get rid of the obstructions that are stopping us, right? And so that's just a wonderful way of looking at it. And obviously, everybody is here, has that aspect. You wouldn't be here. That you have a soul that wants to have a relationship with Hashem, but there are restrictions, and we all have them to different extents. And that's the representative of Egypt. And this is an opportune time to silence, to diminish these forces, these elements of ourselves that are obstructing us from connecting to God, obstructing us from following a path that's, commensurate with God's will, which brings us close to God. I should say that also. So one of the very important fundamental principles in Tanya, in the book Tanya, is that a mitzvah creates a bond with God. And we can look at that from a very rational perspective, in terms of that when you do for the king, that creates a relationship, because he's too lofty for just the average Joe to connect with the king in his great lofty palace. But if he asks us to do something, that forges a connection between us. So similarly, by God asking us and directing us to do something, and then we do it, we can connect. And in other words, when we take that mission upon ourselves, we're connected. So that's, one approach. But a more mystical approach is that God is like sort of self-invested in the Torah and the commandments, and we're really connecting directly with him through them, everyone to whatever aspect they're able to. So certainly, when it's kind of like with the person, when you do what they want, you forge a connection and you make them happy and you find favor in their eyes, and you forge a connection, you forge a relationship. Again, particularly with a leader, with the king, the parent, you reinforce the relationship. So again, in Hasidic thinking, my students know this already, is there's this concept of making the world a dwelling place for God, right? And so the Bnei Noach, through making the world a more moral place and a more civilized place, you make this earth a more fitting dwelling place for God, and assist Israel in that job. You could be making Israel's job easier. For example, if the nations were more on the right track, then they would have less of a negative influence on the Jewish people, right? In other words, whatever effects, because it's impossible not, because all the nations, we're all human beings, so we're all living together, and we're affected by each other. So if the majority of the people of the world are living in a more moral fashion, that also assists Israel, that instead of having to isolate as much and fight against negative influences from outside, they can focus more on positive, because the negative influence of the world have been minimized. For example, let's say the nations ceased, idolatry completely. So that wouldn't be an element that the Jews would have to kind of self-fight and stay away from, as like before. We'd all be on the same page that, there's a creator, that he's a lawgiver, and so on. All these basic things would be in agreement, and we'd be working on a totally different plane. We'd be working on a totally different level, right? Because we wouldn't have to fight on those issues. We wouldn't have to be challenged by those issues. So it could be a tremendous, tremendous improvement in the status of the world, and many other things. So the point is, through doing what God wants, which is what's called creating a dwelling place for the divine presence here below, you find favor in God's eyes, and you forge a deeper connection. Yes, James.
Rabbi, you said something profound right after mitzvot vote causes a relation connection with God. And then you said something after that, and I lost it. I didn't write it down fast enough. I didn't have time to write it down. Do you remember what that was?
Okay, first I said there's a rational explanation for that bond and connection, because when you do the command of a king, that forges a connection, even though the status of the two individuals are so different. So too, between God and man, obviously the distance is immeasurable, but the command creates the link. So that was one thing that I said. And then the second thing I said was that God invests himself in the commandments. It's kind of when you really have a deep yearning for some objective. And that's really what you're busy with all the time. So it's almost like your whole being is there. So, I mean, this is anthropomorphism, of course, because God is not like a person. But on the other hand, we're slightly a little bit like him in any event. So God isn't, so to speak, the best that we can understand, invested himself in the commandments, in Torah and the commandments. It's what he really cares about, so to speak. That's what he's really about. You know, there's other things he does, like creates the world, but it's not what he's really, it's kind of like his 9 to 5 job. You know, if I have to draw analogies, it's his 9 to 5 job, but it's not what he does in his free time, or, you know, it's not what he dreams about. You know, but Torah mitzvahs, that's what he dreams about. That's what he really wants. So therefore, by doing them, you forge a connection, a direct connection. It's not a vehicle, but it's actually almost, it's like direct. It's almost, you know, like an embrace. It's directly touching the king himself. And then what was the last thing I said? Is that also just a more rational view, is that you're finding favor with God, and it also brings you closer. Again, to look at it from a human perspective. But when we fulfill this idea, this objective of making the world a dwelling place for God, we draw down kind of a connection, a deep connection with him, because that's his deepest desire. Chassidus says that this is a desire there's no explanation for it. We can't understand it. Meaning to say, just like a human being, a person's deepest desires have no other reason. They are the reason. They're not a means to any end. They're just an end in themselves, and they don't have any other reason. So too, this idea of a dwelling place has no other reason. There's no other ancillary reason for it. It just is. This is God's greatest pleasure. So
So the way I understand it, and I'm breaking it down to myself is, Rabbi, you're the rabbi. Rabbi says to me, Jim, I like golfing. I'd like for you to go golfing with me. And I go, I can't golf, but I can learn. And so I take up that task and I learn it to be, like kind of good at it. And we go along. And because of that, you find that I find your core value, which is golfing, interesting and important. And that draws you closer to me because I identify with you. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying something even deeper. I'm saying
Okay.
that, let's say you have a man that, you know, that all his life he wanted to, let's say, build a beautiful house for his children, his grandchildren, and that he should own it outright, and it should be for all his future generations to come. And all his life he worked for this, you know, he drove a truck, and he worked in factories, and he saved and he pinched to try to do that, right? But in the end he couldn't do it alone. And he had a good friend, that said, you know what, James, I'm gonna help pitch in too. I'm gonna help you out. We're gonna build this house together. You can't pay for the contractor. I'm gonna be the contractor. You can buy the materials with the money you saved. I'm gonna build it. I'm gonna build it for you. I mean, and he started tears. He started crying. And he was so touched that his life's dream, that someone cared enough to help him. So it's a lot deeper than just golf. It's literally the whole person's whole being has been invested in that. Everything he ever wanted. So that's, and in a certain sense, that's supposed to be the Jewish people. Jewish people are supposed to be people who their souls reflect that idea that their greatest desire is to do the commandments. That's what their life centers about. Everything else really is not that important, secondary. Their whole life is dedicated to this. And that's why they're God's emissaries here. That's the way in a perfect world. This is, and in the Messianic era, this is what's going to be. We're going to see this.
So do we have a deal? I'll sell the townhouse that I'm living in right now for the material if you'll build my house, the next one.
I wish I knew. I can only help you build these kind of blocks that I have here, olive base blocks.
Oh, I like where I live. This is fine. This is just suits me. It's small and simple.
Good.
Yeah, that example of the house was more profound than golfing. You took it deeper.
Yeah, that was the intention.
Thank
So
you.
we kind of went a little bit afield here. I want to bring it back around. Why am I talking about this? What does this have to do with the parsha? But we went a little off. I would say off the plant. What do they say? Off the farm. I forget the language. But anyway, we went a little far afield because the point was I was trying to bring out to you was that the idea of Egypt, Mitzrayim in Hebrew, which means a restriction, an obstruction, and I guess you could say certainly an internal restriction is a repression, where you're not expressing yourself. And I was saying that the advantage of looking at impurity this way is that the focus isn't that, oh my gosh, I could do a sin and we're running away. What bothers us about a sin from a Chabad Hasidic perspective is that we can't connect with God because of the sin. That's what bothers us the most. It's not that we'll do a sin, we'll be punished, and then we're worried that God may punish us. That's not our main concern. Our main concern is that it's an obstacle to connecting with God, which is a very profound and wondrous approach because, first of all, because it really turns the obstacle on its head. And it's something also that Rab Nachman talks about. But why do I say this? Because when a person finds himself in an obstruction, so they yearn, they feel, what they think of, realize is that they're very distant. And distance creates a yearning to be closer, hopefully. I mean, the problem is when you're really far, you don't feel any of this. And that's when you're in trouble. But I mean, just the knowledge of that, it could be helpful. For example, what I'm saying is, and this is all part of really the same issue. So, yeah, we're going far afield, but you know what? It's worth talking about when we keep going, right? So in the Messianic age, one of the approaches, which I think is I mean, the commentaries don't need my approval, but one of the approaches as to why there'll be no war, why there'll be no competition materially, is because even the nations won't be interested. They won't. I think we spoke about such ideas before. They're not going to be interested. They're going to be interested in their relation with God. They're not going to be interested in competing materially for things anymore. They're going to lose interest. And they're going to realize that all blessing comes from God, and there's not going to be any interest in material things. Why do I bring this up? Is because a person can be the opposite. And so far from Mashiach, a person can be so far from a messianic conception that they don't feel a yearning for God. They don't feel any distant. They could feel that they get pleasure from material things and food and whatever and fame and whatever it may be, comforts, and they're good. They don't need anything. And that's a very dangerous place to be, because if a person, has the right mindset, but they have bad habits, that could create a tremendous tension. How do I say? A tremendous, what is the proper word? But it's kind of like when you're holding on to a slingshot and you're pulling it back, and that distance creates more tension, and then the more powerful shot, right? And the rock or the pellet or whatever goes farther. So similarly, when a person has troubles, meaning to say that they can't concentrate on serving Hashem. Let's say that their prayers, they can't concentrate. They're disturbed by various worries, or they're disturbed by various desires. So they can have an awareness of the problem, and that can create a greater yearning to becoming close. And so basically, the obstruction turns into a vehicle of a means to getting closer. And that's actually what it's called. This is what we called, to do. That's why we say that when a person does repents out of love, that the sins turn into merits. Why do they turn into merits? For this very reason, because the sins become a springboard for getting closer. It was the sins that made the person feel low and feel distant and feel terrible and yearn to come close. And the yearning became so great, it was greater than even in the saintly righteous people who were already there. They're already in the club. So they don't feel that tremendous emotional yearning as the person who realizes how far they've gone. And so therefore, all the sins turn into merits because they were the springboard that brought the person up. But if a person, God forbid, could come to a place where they're so low that they don't realize that they're so low and they feel no yearning, that could be the comparison of the Israelites who died in Egypt. It says that during the plague of darkness, there are many, many Israelites died. They didn't leave. They didn't leave Egypt. And one explanation is because they didn't want to. And so they died there. Whether that means a literal death or they died as Jews and Israelites and they were lost, the simple midrash meaning is they actually were killed in the plague. But, a spiritual death is just as bad. So the point is they were lost because they had lost their sensitivity completely. And that could be part of the idea that we say also that God took the children of Israel out of Egypt. At that time, they were within the 49 gates of impurity. If they will reach the 50th gate, they couldn't have came on, right? I think this is the same idea, that if they would have reached the 50th gate, there would have been no way to bring them back to they would have had no way to come back to feel this yearning and to realize that they're in the wrong place. They would have felt completely complacent. They would have had the full, in other words, what is these 50 gates are the 50 gates of impure understanding. So they would have been completely rationalized on every level towards, hedonism, towards self-centeredness, towards, every improper way of thinking and being. And there would have been no way for them to feel out of place, to feel like, what am I doing here? This is not me. I need to get out of this. They would have been lost. That's basically, so in other words, basically what we're saying here is that when you see a person who is living in a very hedonistic lifestyle or, doing many things that are not moral or not in a noble, sacred way, and they're happy with it, that's a bigger problem than if they're disturbed. A person who's disturbed, who's how do I say, they're conflicted, we have something to work with. That means that they realize that their soul, there's something alive that say this is wrong, and they feel remorse, but they're drawn, they can't control it, so they're back and forth. Okay, we have a living person, we have something alive there. It's like the fish out of water, and it's still moving around, it's still shaking, it's still doing something. But once it's laying limp, it's dead. There's nothing going on anymore. So too, and I think, listen, we can never believe a person is lost. but it simply means that when you see a person that they're very happy and satisfied with having an empty life, that's a more dangerous situation than a person who is not satisfied with an empty life. Make sense? So basically, that's the idea of the obstructions of Egypt in a metaphysical, mystical and spiritual sense. That we feel that we're disturbed. We feel like we want to connect and we just can't. And we know we have bad habits. We want to break them, but we can't seem to do it. And we're just stuck. But the beauty is we're not lost because we know that there's something wrong. But at the same time, we're conflicted with complacency because you know what? If we really cared enough, maybe we could break out. Or if we had a deep enough feeling enough, maybe we could break out. But it's not enough. Our habits are so heavy, and we kind of just surrender to those habits. We have a moment to feel I shouldn't be doing this, and like, oh, here we go, I'm doing it, all right, and we're just stuck in it, and so. So interestingly enough, another thing that is stated here, an interesting idea, beautiful, beautiful, profound idea, which I don't think I mentioned last week. So there's a verse, I think it was last week, that talks about, it says that Aaron and Moses spoke to the children of Israel. And then it says, and Moses and Aaron spoke to Pharaoh. These are the Aaron and Moses that spoke to the children of Israel, led them. This is Moses and Aaron that spoke to Pharaoh. So the question is, why the difference in the order of the two brothers? Why is one it says Aaron was first and the other it says Moses was first? So again, from a spiritual allegorical sense, but you could say in the most truthful sense. So Aaron represents divine holy intellect, a holy moral way of looking at things. Moses represents a supra-rational inspiration, a positive, noble, holy inspiration, which means person has a feeling something's right, and it's not based on intellect. It's just a deep-seated gut, it's coming from their soul, from inside. Or I should say it a different way, it's hitting them in a way that touches a deep place. So that's Moses. So basically the way that the Chassidus explains, the Rebbe explains, is this way. He says when it came to, so the Jewish people, the children of Israel represent the divine soul. Good impulses. So good impulses and good intellect can be inspired by Torah, by intellectual good ideas and divine conceptions about God, about how to way to live, and talking, you can affect it. But he says, however, Egypt, it's mainly Moses. In other words, it has to be hit with like miracles, with things beyond nature. It has to be hit with something really, a heavy awakening to shake it up. So and this is what we see, the Egyptians, they wouldn't budge until they were hit with miracles and plagues, and then they gave in. Not only they gave in, we see something incredible that they actually became fond of the Israelites at the end. In the end of this week's reading, we see that the Israelites found favor in the eyes of the Egyptians and they gave them their possessions and so on. So there was a very interesting relationship here between the Egyptians and the Israelites, is that there was a part of the Egyptians that actually learned to respect them and even to grow fond of them. And that's very fascinating, but it's a very good sign, right? In terms of it represents that they were so shaken up by the plagues and what it meant that they actually followed along to a certain extent. They were convinced to cooperate. And so again, metaphorically, this is this idea too that a person will be hit by a supra-rational inspiration from God that's what needs to shake up their core, or I should say their body, this part of being. So how do you do that? I mean, I spoke about this a little bit last week, and I was talking about saying holy words. So you have to, So question is, how does somebody do that? How does somebody reach a level that's above nature? So one way really is to connecting to the Jewish people through the Torah of the Jewish people, because the Jewish people exist on a level that's above nature. They represent the bridge between God and the natural world. Because I mean, there's many reasons for this. One is that the Jewish people really naturally shouldn't even exist, and they exist on miracles. The fact that the nations, that they haven't assimilated, that they haven't been exterminated, this itself is a miracle. And again, we see from the readings the last few weeks that through the Jewish people, God works miracles in the world for their sake, however you want to say it. So one approach would be to connect with them. And also, I suggested last time, and it says in Hasidic works, that saying words of Torah or prayer can bring about an inspiration that's above in other words, rational side is you think about something rationally in your mind. You meditate on God and that he's the creator and that everything's created from nothing because of him. Again, it's something that Hasidus discusses. When a person himself, through his own intellect, meditates and tries to connect to God through meditation. But that's on a rational level. So that's kind of the person primarily working on his divine soul. That's kind of what we're saying here. Although there's many approaches to this. In a certain sense, the persons could also be working on their physical soul. Depends on how they communicate these ideas. It could also, for example, if a person meditates on the fact that their physical existence also comes from God, so that's already talking to their physical body. If the body realizes what its source is, and that its vitality is coming from God, that maybe also be a way to, excite the body. Another way is like how the body becomes aware that, in the resurrection, that the body will be recreated by God, the Chayei Mason, right? That God will resurrect the righteous people, and the body as well to live in an eternal fashion. That's something that the body could maybe get excited about. Does that make sense? Right? Suddenly, it's like there's actually a bodily reason to want to do good and be holy, because the body, if we do the right thing, the body will continue to exist on a much more lofty way than it exists now, on a whole other plane, whole other existence. And again, it says that the pious among the Gentiles have a portion in the world to come, which is, according to the consensus or the majority opinion, means during the resurrection. So if that's the case, that's another way. I'm getting off topic because I just want to be clear about what I'm saying and telling you the different aspects of this idea. But anyway, in this place, the Rebbe is saying that intellectually is primarily to your conscious, to your good side. And to really affect your animal side, really shake it up and change it, you have to kind of have elements that are above. And those elements that are above come through prayer, saying like Psalms, saying holy words of Torah. And I think the other way is kind of something we said today, which is through doing things that are above reason, which is self-sacrifice things. A person breaks their inhibition. For example, a person doesn't want to give a certain amount of charity, or a person doesn't want to, whatever it is, there's something they don't want to do that they should be doing, and they're uncomfortable. They feel like they may be mocked, and they push. They take a little bit of a risk, and they say, you know what, I'm doing it. I'm doing it. I don't know what the future exactly is going to be doing it, but I'm doing it. Many of you have already done this, just in your lives. I mean, but I'm just, as we continue, you continue up the ladder, we continue doing it. So, I got a message. Where is my chat here? Let's see. Then I have a message from James, from me. Okay. So James says, when it comes to a difficult decision, looks for the higher good. Very good. It's not easy to do that. Really isn't. Really isn't. There's sometimes they say a trick that the thing you don't want to do is the thing that you should probably be doing. But that's a tricky one because that's not always the case. But it often is the case. Um, anyway, again, I'm going to get off topic. I don't want to get more off topic, but back to this idea again. So Pharaoh and the plagues represents the idea that they represent the body and the physical aspect that is, habituated. Its nature is to want to be self-centered and enjoy pleasures and be lazy and, have no connection with God, just to have a connection with materiality. And that's what it wants. The part of us that just wants more, whatever it is, more physical conveniences and pleasures, more money, more fame, more popularity, all these different things that are, self-centered to different levels of sensitivity. As you go up the ladder, and they're more emotional, they're more, and I'm not saying a person shouldn't have any of those things, but what I'm saying is that how do we get the body who's solely interested in these things to get interested in connecting with God? That's my point. How do we do that? In other words, for example, a person's in synagogue and they're distracted by other people instead of focusing on their prayers, because we're social animals. So the social, emotional part of the person that wants companionship or connections or whatever is disturbing. You're trying to communicate with God. So in that scenario, that's not helpful, right? So how do you bring everybody on the same page, or at least dominate with your focus on God in that situation? So that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about how do we inspire that part of us to also cooperate. So so we're saying that we need some kind of like a miracle, which means really we need a revelation, some type of an inspiration that's above the rational, which is like a miracle. So I mean, the question is, how do we do this? I mean, we don't see miracles. I mean, it's an interesting point to make, but I mean, how is this relevant to us? Jews and Gentiles included. I mean, we don't see open miracles. So what are we stuck? The body is just going to stay down below. What are we going to do here? So that's what I'm saying. There's another aspect to this, and that is there are certain revelations from Torah and the commandments which are also supra-rational. We need to try to connect to it in a supra-rational form. And one way of doing that is doing them unconditionally, right? That's kind of, or in a self-sacrifice type of a manner. And by the way, one of the ways you can do that, very simple, something that mentions in Tanya, is that you set a time for Torah study or prayer, and it's uncompromising. You don't stop. You don't sometimes break it because you have to do something else. It's an absolute rule that you don't break. This is the time. Nothing else exists in that time. So during that period, you are divesting yourself of physical wants and concerns. So that's a form of self-sacrifice. So that's one way to go about doing it, which hopefully will have the effect that I'm talking about. And the other thing I said is that in mystical thought, there's this idea that speech, saying holy words, has an effect on us that's beyond their meaning. Beyond the meaning, the rational meaning that we're aware of. So particularly that, I guess, would be in Hebrew. But I think if a person says psalms or prayers, verbally, and probably also the scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures verbally, particularly the 5 books, it should have a positive, above reason effect on the person. Okay, so any questions or comments? We've been talking for a while now. It's almost the end of the session, so it's time.